She had a bullet hole in her palm. Cattle Baron kissed it every morning. The deed to the Crail Valley Range is sitting on the corner of my desk right now. I can see it from here. 43,000 acres of grass and water and sky, and my name is at the bottom of every page. Elia's Cord, that's me, has been for 61 years. I look at that deed most mornings when I come in here to write letters I don't finish, and I think about how a man can own all of something and still not know what he's got. Not really. I thought I knew. First time I rode across that valley, I was 19 years old, and I told myself, this is the place. Took me another 30 years to figure out that the place wasn't the thing. The place was just dirt. The thing was her. Clara Me Arden, Clara Cord now. Has been for going on 22 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how old men tell stories, backwards, sideways, circling the part they mean to say. Let me circle it right. My father came out to this country with nothing but a mule and a land claim and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't distinguish itself from stupidity until enough years have passed to call it one or the other. He built the first 2 rooms of this house with his own hands, and he took on cattle, and he worked. That's the word for it, worked. Not built or grew or succeeded, just worked. Every day against everything, until the land either broke you or bent to you, and he was the kind of man the land could not break. I'm like him in that, I know it. Clara tells me I'm like him in other ways too, harder ways, quieter ways, and she says it without judgment but also without softening it. She's like that. She tells the truth the way a woman tells it when she's not afraid of what you'll do with it. My mother died when I was 11, fever. She was 34 years old. After that it was my father and me and the land, and my father was not a man who talked about things he couldn't fix. He didn't talk about her much. He worked. I learned to work the same way, not because he told me to, but because what else do you do when you're 11 and the world has gone suddenly smaller and the only man left in it doesn't know how to hold you in his arms without it costing him something? I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it matters to the rest of it. A man who grew up that way, working, silent, measuring everything by what he could hold in his hands doesn't expect softness. Doesn't look for it. Gets to 40 years old and he's built something real and solid and enormous and he's alone inside all of it and he thinks, this is what a man is. This is enough. I thought that for a long time. Maybe I needed to think it to get through it. The summer her father died, I was 40 years old. Harlan Arden had been ranching the East Bench since before I was born, a hard man, people said, but they said it the way you say it about the weather. It just was what it was and you worked around it. His spread butted up against mine along Pichon Creek. We'd had words over that creek more than once. Had words over cattle strays, fence lines, water rights. Nothing that drew blood. Just the low-grade constant friction of 2 men who needed the same water. Then Harlan got sick, cancer, the doctor in Lassiter said, though Harlan never said the word himself, and he was dead inside of 4 months. He didn't complain about it. Didn't talk about it, as far as I could tell, to anyone. He just got thinner and slower, and then one morning he didn't get up, and by noon he was dead. His foreman, a man called Dobb, who'd worked the Arden place for 20 years, rode over to tell me. He said it like a report. Mr. Arden passed this morning. I said, I'm sorry to hear it. Dobb nodded and rode back. That was Harlan's funeral, in a manner of speaking. I'd never met the daughter. Clara had been in Kansas City. Harlan had a sister out there, and Clara had gone after her mother died, which was before my time in the valley. She'd been gone maybe 8 years, gone since she was a girl, and nobody expected her back. Everybody expected Harlan's spread to sell at auction. There was talk. Merchants in town, the Greer brothers from up the valley, men with money and plans always know when land is about to go loose. I wasn't one of the ones making plans. I already had more land than I could properly manage. I had 2 foremen and 32 hands and a cook who drank and a herd that was doing fine, but costing me in ways that kept me up on certain nights looking at numbers. I didn't need Harlan's ground. What I needed, most people would have told you, was a wife. But that was none of their business, and I told them so when they said it. Which they did, often. I had been married once. Meredith. We were young, I was 24, she was 22, and she lasted 3 winters on this ground before the isolation settled into her like a cold that won't break. She wasn't a bad woman. She just needed more than I had in me to give at that age, or more than this country could give, and one spring she went to her sister's in Wichita and wrote me a letter that was fair and honest and final. I kept the letter. Still have it. It's in the bottom drawer of this desk, under everything else. After Meredith, I worked. That was my answer to most things. I built and bought and ran cattle and dug fence posts until my hands were so calloused I could press them flat to a hot stovetop and not feel it right away. Which I did once, on a bet, for $20 and the respect of 6 cowboys who were drunk enough to believe it mattered. I was not a man women found easy. I knew that. I did not much care. There was a woman in Lassiter for a while. Elaine ran the boarding house, and we had an understanding for about 2 years. She was practical about it, and so was I. It ended when she married the mill owner from Corrigan, which was the right thing for her, and I wished her well and meant it. After Elaine, I didn't look anymore. I told myself I didn't need it. I told myself the land was enough. A man tells himself a lot of things in the quiet hours when there's no one else listening. So when Clara Arden came back to the valley that September to settle her father's estate, I did not make any plans. I noticed her the way you notice a change in weather, registered it, filed it away, figured on how it might affect what I was doing. I went over to the Arden place 2 days after she arrived because I had legitimate business. A stretch of fence along Pichon Creek that had come down in the spring flooding, and I needed to know if she was going to maintain it or if I needed to string new wire on my side. That was the whole of my intention. She was in the yard when I rode in. She had on a dark blue dress that was wrong for the country, too much fabric, meant for town, and she was wrestling a stuck gate latch with both hands. Didn't look up when my horse came through the outer gate. I said, "Miss Arden." She said, "If you're here to buy the land, talk to the lawyer in Lassiter." Then she got the latch to give, finally, and the gate banged open hard and she had to step back quick to keep from being knocked. I said I wasn't here about the land. I was here about the fence. She looked at me then. She had dark eyes, not soft dark, the kind of dark that means there's been trouble and it didn't break her, just made the color go deeper. She was maybe 26, 27. Her hair was pinned up but coming loose on one side. She had dirt on her forearm from the gate. She was not what I'd expected. I'm not sure what I'd expected. Something softer, I suppose, a city woman who'd come back to sell her dead father's ranch and go back to where she came from. She didn't look like that. She said, "What fence?" I told her. The Pichon Creek line, the section near the North Oxbow, how the high water in April had taken out 8 posts and probably 120 feet of wire. She listened. Didn't interrupt, didn't rush me, didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary. When I was done, she said she'd walk the line with me if I had time, which I did. That was the whole of it that first day. We walked a 1/4 mile of creek fence in September afternoon light, and she asked good questions about the water table, about whether the creek tended to cut east or west in high water years, about the soil composition near the bank. She knew what she was asking. 8 years in Kansas City had not made her ignorant of the land. When I answered, she listened the way smart people listen, like what you're saying might actually change something she does next. Harlan had been a talker. Clara was a listener, I noticed that. When we got back to her gate, she said she'd have her men, 2 hands, both old and half used up, Cleet and Dobb, who'd been on the Arden place longer than she'd been alive, get started on the fence that week. I said all right. She said she was staying through winter at least, getting the place in order, deciding what to do with it. I said, "Winter on the bench is long." She said, "I expect it is." I rode home. I thought about the dark eyes and the way she'd listened and the dirt on her forearm and the fact that she'd asked about soil composition. I thought, interesting woman, I thought, that is absolutely none of your business, Elias, ride home and work. I did. Here is where I should tell you about the Greer brothers, because they are the second thread in this story, and the 2 threads wind together whether I want them to or not. Dale and Rufus Greer. Dale was the brains, such as they were, and Rufus was the muscle, which was considerable. Rufus stood 6'3" and had hands like mallets and a short temper that he wore on the outside where everyone could see it. They ran the biggest spread north of Lassiter, inherited from their father who'd taken it by methods nobody examined too closely. The valley had been afraid of the Greers for a generation. Not the loud, announced kind of afraid, the quiet kind, where men make decisions around the Greers the way water makes decisions around a stone. Just move, don't push. I had not moved around them. That was a source of friction that had never fully resolved. We'd had 2 genuine disputes over the years, one involving grazing rights on a dry summer stretch that both our herds needed, one involving a hand of mine they'd beaten badly enough to put him in the Lassiter doctors for 3 weeks over a card game that wasn't even on my property. I'd gone to the marshal about that second one. Nothing came of it. The marshal's name was Pelton, and he was the kind of man whose salary was, in some portion, the Greer's business. He did what men do in that situation. He looked at the ceiling and waited for me to finish talking. The thing about the Greers was they were patient. Dale especially. He didn't move fast. He waited and he planned and he bought debt when he could buy it, and he squeezed water rights when he could squeeze them. And he accumulated through attrition the same way weather accumulates damage, slowly, a little at a time, until one day you look up and the damage is done and you can't say exactly when it happened. The Greers wanted the Arden ground. The East Bench had good grass and, more importantly, good water. The Pichon Creek ran sweet year-round, and the spring seeps on the south slope of the bench were the kind of resource that could keep a herd through a dry summer. I knew this. The Greers knew this. Anyone who knew cattle in this valley knew this. Dale Greer made Clara Arden an offer in her 3rd week back. I heard this from my foreman, Benny Mace, who heard it from the dry goods man in town, who heard it from Harlan's lawyer. The offer was low. I knew the acreage and the water rights and the fair market, and the offer was about 60 cents on the dollar, which was not an accident, which was an opening move. Clara said no. Greer came back with another offer 2 weeks later, slightly better, still short. Clara said no again. This interested me. I'd watched people get ground down by the Greers. It took time, but it worked. They'd outlast you, buy up your debts if you had them, cut your water if they could, make the valley uncomfortable until selling started to look like relief rather than surrender. Clara Arden had been back in this country for less than a month, and she was already holding a line that older, harder-rooted men had not held. Men with more years in the valley, more horses, more hands, more reason to stay, men who'd eventually gone soft in the right place and taken the low offer and told themselves it was a fair deal. She'd been here a month, she'd come from Kansas City, and she was saying no. I went back to the Arden place in October. Legitimate reason. I had a steer of hers, had wandered through the repaired fence through a section we'd missed, turned up in my south pasture 3 days running. I brought it back. She was in the barn when I came. She had the sleeves of a work shirt rolled up, and she was doing something to a horse's foreleg, a bay gelding, standing patient, with a poultice that smelled of pine and rendered lard. It was an old remedy, the kind you didn't learn in Kansas City. She'd learned it here before she left and kept it. I said, "Got a steer of yours?" She said, "I know, thank you. Where was he?" I told her. She nodded and kept working the poultice in with both hands, pressing steady circles. I tied the steer off at the pen gate, and I should have left. I didn't. I said, "You turned down the Greers." She looked up at me, said, "Did you come to tell me I was wrong to?" I said, "No. I came to tell you it won't stop at 2 offers." She turned back to the horse's leg, worked the poultice in, not rushed. After a moment she said, "My father spent his whole life out here. He was not an easy man to know. I don't think I knew him, really, not the way a daughter ought to know a father. But he built this place out of nothing, and he never sold an inch of it to anyone who wanted it for reasons that weren't good for the land. He said that to me once, just that once, when I was about 12 years old. He said, 'Clara, a man who sells his land for the wrong reasons never gets right again.' I was 12. I didn't know what he meant. She said, 'I think I know what he meant now.' I didn't say anything to that. She said, 'You think I can't hold it?' I said, 'I think you can. I think it will cost you.' She said, 'Most things worth keeping do.' I rode home, thought about that for about a week. Not about the land, about her. About the way she'd said it, not defiant, just factual, as if it were something she'd already fully accepted. November came cold and early. Snow on the bench by the 3rd week, which wasn't unheard of but wasn't common. Usually you had until mid-December before real winter bit. This year the winter didn't wait. The cold came down the neck of the valley like it had somewhere to be. Her 2 old hands, Cleet and Dob, were stretched thin. Both of them good men, both of them past their best years by a decade at least. Cleet was maybe 60, had bad knees from a horse fall 15 years back. Dob was slightly younger but slower, and he had a chest that rattled in the cold. They were loyal to the Arden place the way old horses are loyal, not going anywhere, not complaining, just working until they couldn't. But there wasn't enough of the 3 of them, Clara, Cleet, Dob, to manage the place properly through that early winter, and I could see it every time I rode along the bench looking at what needed doing. The fences needed work. The barn roof had a soft section over the south stall that was going to give when the snow loaded up on it. The cattle needed rotating off the high pasture before the grass went under ice. These were not catastrophes, but they were the kind of jobs that compound on a short-handed place. Let them go, and in a month you've got 3 catastrophes instead of 3 inconveniences. I sent 2 of my men over, not asking permission, not leaving it as a favor she could decline. I told Benny to send Arroyo and Nate Fenn for 3 days to fix that barn roof before snow came in earnest. They went. I sent word with them. I had men with slack time. It was just practical, no debt on either side. Clara sent word back by Arroyo. She accepted, and she'd feed my men, and what could she do in return? I sent back nothing. The fence repair on Pichan was compensation enough. She sent back Arroyo carried it folded in his shirt pocket, slightly damp, a bottle of rye and a note written on the back of what looked like a bill of lading. The note said, "I don't know how to accept favors gracefully, but I'm practicing. See." I read that note more times than I needed to. More times than made any kind of sense for a grown man who had 32 hands and 43,000 acres, and no time for foolishness. I left it on top of the desk for 3 days before I put it in the drawer. The trouble started in December. Not fast, not dramatic, that's not how the Greers worked. It started the way a river starts to work at a bank, quietly with patience testing for the weak spot. Somebody cut her west fence. 3 times in 2 weeks, different sections each time, so it wasn't a weak post or old wire. It was deliberate, and it was rotated to make it look like random failure. Her cattle got into the Greer North pasture twice when the fence was down, and Dale Greer sent a man to the Arden place each time to collect a stray fee. Not a legal fee. Not a customary fee. Just the kind of fee you present when you want to establish the habit of the other person paying you, and you want to do it before they've had time to think about whether they should. Clara didn't pay it. She told his man to get off her property. Then somebody poisoned her water trough. Not completely, enough to sicken 4 head, not kill them. The cattle recovered. The kind of poisoning you do with a small amount of something bitter that disperses, leaves no residue anyone will find in 3 days, and kills nothing outright. The kind of message that says, we can do this again, and next time we don't have to be careful about the amount. I heard about the trough from Benny, who'd heard from Cleet when Cleet came to our place to buy quinine sulfate from our stores. I rode over that afternoon. It was a gray, still December day, cold enough that your breath hung in front of your face like something you'd said that you couldn't take back. She was in the barn. The gray mare was in the second stall, and Clara was combing her out, slow and even strokes, the kind of task that isn't necessary but gives your hands something to do while your head works. She didn't look upset when I came in. She looked like a woman who has already been upset and come out the other side of it into something that holds. She said, "You heard." I said, "I heard." She said, "You know who did it." I said, "I have a reasonable idea." She said, "Can it be proven?" I said, "Probably not in a way Pelton will act on." She nodded. She kept combing the mare. There was something in her face, not fear, not anger exactly, but the weight of a calculation she was making. How long can I hold this? What is it going to take? What am I willing to give for what I'm trying to keep? I said, "Clara, I've been doing business in this valley for 30 years. I know how they work. This is just the beginning." She said, "I know that." I said, "You might consider not selling to them. But if you deed it over to me, I'll pay you fair value, a good price, and you could." She said, "No." Just that, no. The way she said it wasn't angry, wasn't even particularly firm. It was just the truth of what she'd already decided. I said, "I'm not trying to." She said, "I know you're not, but no. My father built this place, and I'm not going to be the one who lost it. Not to the Greers, not to you, not to anyone." I stood there in the cold of her barn for a moment with nothing useful to say. She wasn't wrong, and I wasn't sure, honestly, that I actually wanted her to sell to me. I wasn't sure what I wanted. I said, "All right, but you need to understand what you're holding against." She stopped combing and looked at me. She said, "Then tell me, I want to know all of it." So I told her, everything I knew. How the Greers operated, the slow squeeze, the way they worked in layers, starting with soft pressure that escalated gradually enough that each step seemed like a small thing until you looked back and realized you'd been giving ground for a year. I told her about the debt buying, how Dale Greer had bought out a note on the Cassidy place 3 years back and used it to force a sale when Cassidy missed a payment. I told her about the water cutting, The time they diverted a spring feeder above the Loma's homestead for 6 weeks during the dry season, technically on their own land, technically legal, until Loma's cattle were dying and Loma's himself was begging for terms. I told her about the hand of mine they'd beaten. Tommy Welk, 23 years old, good cowboy, walked with a hitch in his left leg ever since because Rufus Greer had decided an argument over cards required a lesson. I told her about Marshall Pelton and the relationship there, what it cost and what it bought. I told her about the Whitmore family who'd had a spread west of the Greer North pasture for 12 years. Albert Whitmore had told me afterward, we'd had a drink in Lassiter, and he'd told me with the flat eyes of a man who is still angry but has decided to stop fighting, that it had felt like being drowned slowly in shallow water. No single moment you could point to, just the accumulation of it. The fence cuttings and the water problems, and the way the marshal looked the other way, and the debts coming due, and the town starting to treat you like someone who was already leaving. Until the day you signed the papers and it was over, and you weren't sure whether what you felt was relief or humiliation or both. Clara listened to all of it. She stood with her arms at her sides, not crossed, not defensive, just open, listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "What do you suggest?" I said, "I'll put 2 of my men on your place. Permanent through the winter at least, living here, working here. It changes the calculation for them. They won't want to start a straight fight with me in the middle of it." She said, "Why would you do that?" I said, "Because I've been watching men bend to the Greers for 30 years and it sits badly with me. Because your father's water rights going to Dale Greer would be bad for every spread in this valley, including mine. And because," she was looking at me. I said, "Because it's the right thing to do." All of that was true. The last part was true in a way I wasn't entirely examining yet. She said, "I accept. Same terms as the roof, no obligation, no debt running between us." I said, "No obligation, no debt." I put Arroyo and a man called Whitfield on her place that week. Good men, steady. Arroyo had been with me 8 years, and there was not a situation he couldn't read before it announced itself. Whitfield was younger but solid, not a man who looked for trouble, but absolutely not one who ran from it when trouble came looking. January, the coldest January in 8 years, the old-timers said, and I believed them because I lived it. The cold that year had weight to it, not just temperature but pressure, like the air itself was pushing down on everything. The horses stood with their tails to the wind, even inside windbreaks. The water troughs iced over before daylight every morning. Every job took twice as long because your hands didn't work right below a certain temperature, and below a certain temperature is where we were living. I was over at the Arden place most days by then. I told myself it was oversight, making sure my men were settled in, keeping eyes on how the operation was running, checking in the way a man checks in on a piece of his business. Benny, who'd worked for me for 15 years and knew me better than I knew myself in certain respects, said nothing about this. But Benny had a way of not saying things that communicated more than most men's speeches. He had a way of looking at the horizon when I told him where I was going that day that could fill a room. The truth was that I liked being there. I liked the way she ran the place. She had absorbed 3 months of ranch country winter like she'd never left, methodical, no wasted motion, no small talk with the hands that meant nothing, but also no coldness. She spoke to Cleet and Dobb and my men like she respected their knowledge of what they were doing, which she did, because she had enough knowledge herself to know the difference between a cowboy who knows his work and one who's performing it. She didn't condescend and she didn't coddle. She'd come back from Kansas City, and in 3 months she was running a bench ranch in a hard winter, short-handed with enemies, and she was doing it. Not surviving, doing it, there's a difference. One afternoon in late January, we were at her kitchen table going through her father's papers. Title documents, old bills of sale, water rights agreements going back 20 years. I needed to understand exactly what the Greers were after, which meant understanding the full chain of those water rights in a way I hadn't bothered to when it was Harlan's ground. It had gotten dark while we worked. She'd lit 2 lamps. The wind was up outside, making the window glass tick with grit it had picked up from somewhere. There was a pot of coffee between us that had gone cold. There were papers in 2 stacks on either end of the table and a third pile in the middle of things that wanted cross-referencing. We'd been at it 2 hours. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why didn't you buy this ground yourself when my father died? You said you heard it would go to auction. You had the money." I said I had enough land. She said, nobody in this valley has ever had enough land. That's not how it works here. I said, maybe I'm different. She looked at me across the papers and the cold coffee and the lamplight. That steady look she had. She said, my father talked about you, not often. He wasn't a man who talked about much. But a few times when I was young and when I came back in the letters he sent in Kansas City. He said you were a fair man, he didn't trust you exactly. He said he'd never fully trusted anyone, but he said you were honest. I said, your father and I fought over that creek for 12 years. She said, I know, he told me. He said you fought fair, though. He said you didn't fight dirty when you could have, and in this valley that's not nothing. He said, if it ever came down to something real, Cord's the man I'd trust my water to. I didn't say anything to that. I looked at the papers. She said, I think he was right. The wind hit the window again, and the lamplight shifted slightly, and I stood up and started gathering papers that didn't need gathering right then, just to do something with my hands. I said we should get the water rights survey filed with the county before spring, before the Greers think of doing it first. She said, Elias. I looked at her. She was looking at me with the dark eyes and the steadiness, and she said, I know what you're doing here. I want you to know that I see it. I don't say things the easy way, I keep things in. I know that about myself, but I see it, what you've done here, what you're doing. I said, I just want you to keep your land. She said, I know that too. There was a moment then that I won't describe exactly because I don't have the right words for it, and the wrong words would be worse than none. The lamp made its small sound. The wind touched the glass. She went back to the papers, and I went back to the papers, and something had shifted that hadn't been named in words exactly, but had been named. I rode home in the cold dark thinking about things I hadn't thought about in a long time. I thought about the deed on my desk. I thought about 43,000 acres and a name at the bottom and nothing else. I thought, a man can own all of something and still be empty of what matters. I hadn't thought that before, I thought it then. February was when they escalated. I'd been expecting it. The Greers had tried the soft methods and none of it had moved her. The next step was harder. I'd been watching for it and I still felt it in my gut when it started, the way you feel a change in whether you knew was coming. First, it was a warning. A man I didn't know came to the Arden gate one morning and told Arroyo to tell Miss Arden that the Greer brothers were prepared to make a final offer, and that she should think carefully about what kind of winter a woman alone on the bench could have. That some things were harder to insure against than others. That fire was unpredictable in dry cold. Arroyo told me that evening. I went over. Clara was at the stove when I came in. She had her back to me, stirring something, and she stayed that way for just a moment, not ignoring me, just finishing the thought she was having. When she turned around, I could see she'd heard Arroyo out already and was on the other side of it. She was thinking, not frightened, thinking. She said, they're saying someone could burn us out. I said, that's what they're saying, yes. She said, can they? I said, they can try. I've got men watching 3 sides, but I can't cover every point on the fence line all night every night. She said, what do we do? I said, I want to go to Lassiter, not Pelton, the county sheriff in Millhaven. Man named Amos Crail. File a formal complaint with the county, get this threat on record, make it expensive for them to move openly. She said, how long does that take? I said, the filing is 1 day. The effect is slower than that. She said, and while you're in Lassiter? I said, Whitfield and Arroyo stay here. I'll bring 2 more men from the South crew. She said, and Cleet and Dobb. I said, and Cleet and Dobb. She thought for a moment, then she said, go, but be careful going. If they know you're filing, they'll want to settle it before the ink dries. I'd already thought about that. What I hadn't told her, and I'm still not sure why I didn't. Maybe I thought she'd talk me out of going or change what she was willing to risk. And both of those things would have been her right, was that I'd gotten word from a man named Tully who'd worked for me 2 seasons back and now worked the Greer place. Tully was a decent man in a bad employment situation, and he still had his loyalties sorted correctly. He'd found a way to get word to Benny that Dale Greer had hired 2 men up from the Dakota country. Not cowboys, the other kind. I knew what that meant. I'd been around long enough to know what that meant. I went to Lassiter and I filed with Amos Crail, who was not in the Greer's pocket. That was the first thing I needed to establish. and who listened to me with the particular attention of a man who has been waiting, maybe for years, for someone to bring him exactly this situation. He asked good questions. He wrote things down. He said he'd ride out to the valley inside of a week. I was back at the Arden place by nightfall. It happened 3 days later. 12 degrees, moonless, the kind of night that swallows sound and distance. I'd stayed late. I told myself I stayed because there was a calf coming early in Clara's barn, one of her heifers, young for it. The pregnancy hadn't gone quite right, and she and Cleet were seeing to it, and I'd stayed to help. Which was true. We got the calf out. Small one, a heifer herself, doing all right but needing watching. Cleet went to his bunk after midnight, satisfied. It was near 10 o'clock when the calf was settled and the barn was quiet again. Clara was washing her hands at the basin by the barn door, slow and deliberate. She always washed that way, thorough, taking the time. I was at the small table inside the barn door where she kept her tools and a lamp, looking again at the water rights survey. In a minute I'd say goodnight and ride home in the cold. I heard the horses before I saw anything. Not coming up the lane from the south pasture, moving quiet, keeping to the slope where the wind would take the sound away from the buildings. Men who came that way at that hour were not coming to talk. I said her name. She was already looking at me. I blew out the lamp. What followed was about 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a short time by most measures and a very long one when it's that kind of 4 minutes. There were 4 of them. I found out later there'd been a 5th on the road, the one who hadn't come through the pasture, who turned back when he heard the shooting start. That kind of courage is what you get when you hire for it. 4 men, 2 with torches made from fence posts and rags soaked in coal oil, 2 with rifles. The torches were for the barn and the south fence line. The rifles were for discouragement. Arroyo heard them from the bunkhouse. He'd been asleep light. He slept light when there was something to sleep light about, and he'd been sleeping light for 2 weeks. He was out the bunkhouse door before the first rifle cracked. Whitfield was on the west fence on a rotation I'd set up the week before, moving, not staying put, so you couldn't plan around where he'd be. He heard the horses on the south slope, and he moved toward them, which was the right call and the dangerous one. My 2 men from the south crew, Ferris and a big quiet man called Jenks, were in the barn with me as it happened, because I'd asked them to sleep there that night with the early calf needing watching. That was luck. Or not luck, I'd made that call because I'd been thinking about the Dakota men. The exchange was short and not clean and not controlled. One of the torches got thrown. Hit the corner of the south fence post and caught, not the barn, not the house, just the post, but it lit the area up, and that was worse in some ways because it made you a target and made the dark seem darker past the lit edge. Arroyo put a warning round over their heads, which scattered them some but not entirely. One of the hired men, I found out later his name was Coe, the other was Dillard, 2 names that meant nothing and meant everything on a night like that. Coe fired back. Not over anyone's heads. He hit Whitfield in the shoulder. Whitfield went down at the fence line. Clara was behind me when we came out of the house. I'd gotten her back inside the moment I'd blown the lamp, and she'd come right back out with her father's old Colt, which I hadn't known she kept, hadn't known she could shoot. She was behind me for approximately 10 seconds. Then she was not behind me. She was at my left, tracking. Coe was at the fence line, moving east along it, looking for Whitfield. I saw him, but I had Dillard on my right, and Arroyo needed me on that side. Clara tracked Coe. She fired once and missed. Coe fired back, and the round caught her left hand. Went through the palm. Clean, which is a word you use for a gunshot wound when you mean it didn't shatter bone or take fingers, when you mean the damage was survivable, when you're grateful for what you still have. The bullet went through the meat of the hand between the second and third fingers at the heel, came out the backside. It bled fast and hard and cold in the night air. She went to one knee. She did not drop the gun. I got to her before Coe could get off another round because Arroyo had moved onto Coe from the other angle, and Coe had to make a fast choice. He chose to move instead of fire again, which was the right choice for him and not the wrong one for us. I had Clara by the arm and down behind the fence rail, low, solid wood between us and the line of fire. She was holding her hand against her chest, and the blood was already dark and running down the inside of her wrist and off her fingers. I said, "Let me see it." She opened her hand toward me. It was bad to look at. The cold was slowing the blood some, but not enough. In the firelight from the burning post, I could see the wound clearly, and I knew it needed the doctor, and I knew it needed pressure right now. I had my coat off and my shirt off in about 4 seconds. I know that sounds like something a man says, but it was close to 4 seconds, because when your hands know what they need to do, they work faster than your head does. I pressed the shirt against her palm and folded her fingers over it and told her to hold it tight and keep pressure. She did. She was gray-white in the firelight, the color a person goes when blood is leaving, but her jaw was set like a gate latch that's going to hold. She was not going to fall. She was not going to give ground, not even to blood loss. I'd never seen anything like it exactly. By then the 4 minutes were more or less over. Coe and Dillard and the other two were gone. Arroyo had a graze on his left leg, not serious, already walking. Whitfield's shoulder was real, he'd lost blood, he was down, but he was conscious and telling Jenks where the wound was and what he needed, which is a man who's going to make it. The fence post was still burning, and we'd need water on it before the wind shifted toward the barn, which Ferris was already getting. No fire had caught the structures. The calf was alive and still in her stall, which I thought about later. The most important things it held. I carried Clara inside. She could have walked and she'd have told me so, but I had her already and I didn't think about it. She was bleeding and the cold was real, and I picked her up and brought her inside. Sat her at the kitchen table. Got the lamp going. Put water on the stove. Went to the medicine chest where I'd learned she kept it, on the shelf above the dry goods, brown wooden box, copper clasp. She watched me work. Not past me, not at the wall, not at her hand. At me. With that dark, steady look, fixed on me the way you fix on something when everything else is moving and you need the one thing that stays still. I worked on the hand. Cleaned it with the carbolic and the clean water as best I could. It needed the doctor and I knew it. But there's a difference between what the doctor needs and what needs to happen right now. I packed it tight, bandaged it, wrapped the outside layer firm. I said, it's going to need the doctor in Lassiter in the morning. She said, I know. I said, I should have. I knew about the men from the Dakotas, and I should have told you, and I should have. She said, Elias, stop. I said her name. She said, you were here. That's the thing, everything else, you were here. I was still holding her hand in both of mine, holding the wrapped hand, being careful of the pressure. My shirt was on the floor, and it was February, and I didn't feel the cold at all. She looked at me for a moment. Then she lifted her good hand, her right hand, the unwounded one, and she put it against the side of my face. Just set it there. Her palm against my jaw. Her hand was cold from the night and calloused from 3 months of ranch work, and her thumb was near my cheekbone, and she held it there. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I took her hand carefully from my face, and I held both her hands in mine, her right, her bandaged left, and I put my forehead down against them. Just bent my head and rested it on our joined hands at the table. Outside, the night made sounds that didn't matter anymore. Inside, the lamp burned and the water came up on the stove, and in a minute I'd need to check on Whitfield and get him ready to move to Lassiter at first light. But for that minute, I just stayed where I was. Her hands in mine in the lamplight, and the thing that had been building since September finally just there, no longer waiting to be said. The county sheriff came out 4 days after. Amos Crail, true to his word. He was a thorough man, Crail. He'd been doing the job for 14 years, and he had the look of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people did, but had not stopped caring about what they did. He asked questions in the way a good sheriff asks them, which is not like a lawyer asking questions, but more like a man trying to understand what actually happened, in the right order, with the right weight given to each piece. Dale Greer denied everything, with the particular confidence of a man who has been denying things successfully his whole life, who has watched denials work for 20 years and sees no reason they should stop working now. He sat in the chair in Crail's office in Millhaven with his hat in his hands and his face doing the right things, and he denied it. But Crail had Tully's testimony. Tully gave it because I'd asked him to, and because Whitfield was a friend of his. They'd grown up in the same county in Kansas, 20 years back, and because Whitfield had nearly bled out against a fence post in 12-degree air because of a contract Tully knew the details of. Tully was not a complicated man. When it was that straightforward, he didn't need persuading. Crail had the slug Whitfield took, which his man matched to Dillard's rifle. Dillard wasn't hard to find. He'd been seen in Lassiter in the days before, which was either stupidity or arrogance, and in Dale Greer's organization those qualities were roughly equivalent. He had Clara's testimony. given from the chair in the Lassiter doctor's office with her hand cleaned and resewn and wrapped properly and her voice as level as a man giving a deposition. She didn't embellish. She said what happened in the order it happened. When Crail asked her if she could identify Coe or Dillard, she said no to Coe, it had been dark and she'd only seen him moving. She said yes to Dillard, because Dillard had been in the lit area near the fence post when she'd first come out of the barn, and she had a good eye and she'd marked him. That testimony cost her something, I think. I watched her give it. Not the pain of the hand, she'd already set that aside somewhere behind her eyes. The cost of saying all of it out loud to a stranger in a formal way, the cost of being the person who had been shot at on her own land trying to hold what was hers. She gave it anyway, level and complete and not asking anyone to feel sorry for her. The case went to the county court and it took 3 months, which is fast for a county court. Rufus Greer went to jail 6 months, which was not enough but was something, and was on record and in the Valley's memory. Dale Greer paid fines that were to him approximately the cost of a good horse, but they were public fines attached to a public record, and the Valley read that record and understood what it meant. Coe and Dillard went north and were not found, which was fine. The important men had been found. The water rights we filed with the county in March, properly and completely, and they went on record in Clara's name. I'd had a land attorney from Millhaven look at every document in those papers we'd sorted through in January, and the chain was clean and the rights were solid, and now they were on record in a way that made moving against them expensive in a legal sense as well as a practical one. The land stayed Clara's. In April, when the ground was softening and you could smell the grass beginning under the last of the snow, that particular smell that only happens at first thaw, green and cold at the same time, Clara Arden came to my place. It was a Sunday afternoon. She came alone, riding the bay gelding whose legs she'd poulticed that October day when I'd come back with the steer. She had a bottle of rye in her saddlebag. She tied the gelding at my post and she came up to the door and knocked, which was something she'd never done before. She'd always just come around to where I was, barn or yard or wherever. Knocking at the front door meant something. I opened it. She said, "I have a bottle and a decision to tell you about, and I'd rather not do it standing on your porch." I stepped back and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table I'd been working alone at for 16 years, and she put the bottle between us and I got 2 glasses. I poured. She looked at her glass for a moment. She said, "I've decided to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "February, maybe January if I'm honest." She said, "I've known since November. I just needed to get through the winter." I said, "I know that too." She said, "I was going to say something that night, after you wrapped my hand. I had something I was going to say." I said, "You didn't need to." She said, "I know I didn't need to. I wanted to. But then you put your head down like that and I thought he already knows. Why do you need me to say it?" I said, "I didn't need you to." She said, "But I'm going to anyway." She looked at me across the table with the rye between us and the April afternoon light coming through the window sideways, the way spring light is always sideways and golden. She said, "I came back here because of my father's land. I stayed because of you. Those are 2 different things, and I want you to know I know the difference." I said, "Clara." She said, "I'm not finished. I'm not a woman who does things halfway. I don't know how to do things halfway. If I'm staying, I want to stay right, and staying right means you and me and the land, all of it, and I want to know if that's what you want." I said, "Yes, it's what I want." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "You could have said something in January." I said, "I could have, I didn't know how." She said, "That's honest." I said, "I'm trying." She smiled, that smile of hers, the real one. She said, "I know you are." We drank the rye. We talked until dark, the way you talk when the thing that needed saying has been said and everything else just comes. I told her about my mother and how she died when I was 11 and how my father had answered it by working and how I'd learned the same answer and how it was a good answer for some things and wrong for others. She told me about Kansas City, not the city itself, but what it had been like to be Harlan Arden's daughter from somewhere else. The strangeness of it. The way she'd always felt like she was supposed to be somewhere other than wherever she was, until she came back here and the strangeness had stopped. She said, "I think this is where I'm supposed to be." I said, "I think so too." My foreman, Benny Mace, had worked for me for 15 years by then. He was at the wedding, small affair. the hands and a few people from town and the circuit preacher who came through every 6 weeks and who was surprised to find himself with a wedding on his hands instead of just a Sunday service. June day, the grass high and the hills green in that particular way of early June when everything is new. Clara wore a dress that was blue, the same color as the one she'd been wearing the first day I rode to her gate, and she'd been wrestling that latch. I don't know if she did that on purpose. I never asked. After the ceremony, while people were eating and the June afternoon was going long and gold, Benny came and stood beside me and looked out over the yard and the valley and the hills. He said, without looking at me, "You look like a man who set something heavy down." I said, "Is that a compliment?" He said, "Best one I've got." I think he was right. I think that's what it was. 30 years of building, 30 years of working the way my father had taught me, measuring everything by the ground and the cattle and the numbers in the ledger and the deed on the desk. And then a woman with dark eyes had come back to her father's land and said no when everyone expected yes and stayed when it cost her, and put her hand on my face in the lamplight with blood on her palm, and I had understood something that the ground had never taught me. A man can own all of something and still be empty of what matters. I want to tell you about the hand, the left hand, the one that still carries the scar. It healed clean. The doctor in Lassiter, Avery, his name was, a careful man, 20 years of frontier medicine, did good work on it. The wound was clean going through, no bone damaged, one small nerve cut that left a patch of numbness on the heel of the hand about the size of a silver dollar. The scar runs from just below the second knuckle out to the heel of the hand, an inch and a half, slightly raised in the center, puckered the way scar tissue pulls inward as it heals. Over time it whitened. The raised part smoothed some, but not all the way. In cold weather it aches. She doesn't say so. I know because I watch her hands the way you watch something that matters to you, not constantly, not obviously, but the way you know where something is in a room without looking directly at it. In cold weather she'll curl that hand slightly, fingers just barely closed, when she thinks no one's looking. Every morning I'm up before her. I've always been an early riser, something my father gave me that I couldn't have refused even if I'd tried. I go into the kitchen and I make the coffee and I wait, and in about 15 minutes she comes in, still half asleep, her hair not yet pinned, wearing the old heavy coat she throws over her night clothes in the cold mornings. She'll come to the table or to the stove or to the window and she'll set her left hand on the back of the chair or on the table edge. And I'll pick it up. It started in that first winter we were married. No discussion, no decision, just one morning I took her hand and held it and ran my thumb over the scar and she let me. And the next morning I did it again. And it became the thing it is now, 22 years of mornings, the thing we do before the day starts, before everything else. She can't always feel my thumb on the scar itself because of where the nerve was cut, but she knows I'm doing it. She'll look at me sometimes in that particular way of hers, like she's seeing something she already knew was there and is glad to find it still there. And then the coffee is done and the day is there and we're back to work. I do it because I was there, because of the lamplight in February and the blood and her setting her hand on my face with nothing to say that needed saying. Because I understood in that moment that being the man she turned to when the thing was real and hard, that being that man was the measure, not the ground, not the deed, the man she turned to. I have been that man for 22 years. Our son James Harlan Cord is 19 years old this summer. Harlan for her father, who didn't know him and would have been difficult company if he had. James has his mother's dark eyes and a version of my hands, broader through the palm, which he gets from somewhere I can't account for, and a stubbornness that is entirely its own thing, not mine, not hers, just his. He's on the South Pasture rotation this summer, making the mistakes you have to make to learn the right way and learning the right way after. He asked me once, he was maybe 15, he asked me how I knew. I asked him, knew what? He said, how did you know about Mom? How did you know she was the one? I thought about it. I said, she stayed when it cost her something. That's a thing that tells you what a person is made of. He said, is that it? I said, that's most of it. The rest I couldn't say in words you'd understand yet. He thought about that. He said, you mean I have to wait? I said, you mean you have to live enough to understand it, which is the same as waiting, mostly. He seemed to accept that. He's a patient boy under the stubbornness. He'll be all right. Our daughter Nora is 16. She's something else, sharper than either of her parents in the ways that will matter in 20 years, with a mind that works fast and sideways and doesn't settle for the easy version of anything. She wants to study law. She's been reading Benny's old law books since she was 13. Benny was a reader, had a shelf of them, and she asks questions about the water rights and the title documents and the county records that I don't always have the answers to. She's going to do something with that. I don't know what exactly. Something that matters. Clara said to me last fall, she's going to run this place one day, the whole valley. I said, the valley's not ours to run. Clara said, no, but it listens when we talk, and she'll have a voice in it that carries. That sounds right to me. The valley changed. The Greers are not nothing. They never became nothing, because that's not how the world works. The large don't become small because they lost one fight. But something changed in the quality of what they were after the trial. Something in the particular texture of the fear. The valley had watched what happened with Clara's ground, watched the county sheriff come in and the case go on record and the fines get paid and the jail sentence served. Watched a woman with a bullet hole in her hand sit in a chair in Millhaven and give testimony that held up, and watched a cattle baron from the other end of the valley stand up with her. I've seen 3 or 4 things since then that I wouldn't have seen 10 years before. A smaller man taking a creek dispute to the county instead of settling it by who was more afraid. A family holding against a pressure offer longer than any family in the valley had held before. Small things individually, but they add up. You can't build a thing like that on purpose. You can only be what you are and do what the situation asks of you, and if enough years pass, something accumulates. Clara would tell you she was just trying to keep her father's land. She'd tell you it was nothing more than that. She'd be lying, but she'd believe it when she said it. She was keeping her father's land. She was also, without trying, showing this valley what it looked like when someone held their ground for the right reasons, and what it looked like when someone stood at their side for the right reasons. Those things run outward. You don't control where they go. Most evenings in summer, we sit on the porch. Not every evening we're working people. There is always something. And on a ranch there is always something, always the next thing that needs doing before the one after that can be started. But most evenings in July and August, when the long light comes in low and horizontal across the grass, and the valley goes gold, and the sound goes quiet except for whatever the wind decides to say. Clara brings coffee out, or sometimes I do. We don't talk much in the evenings. We've talked all day, or we've been apart all day doing separate work, and either way by evening we don't need to fill the silence. The silence on a summer porch in the valley is not empty. It's full of the day and the light and the land and the 22 years. Her left hand on the arm of the chair, curled just slightly the way it does when she's easy. And sometimes, not every evening, but sometimes, when the light is right and the day has been good and nothing is pressing, I'll reach over and take it. Hold it in mine, the scar under my thumb where my thumb finds it without looking, without needing to look. She always lets me. I've thought about why I keep doing it, 22 years in. Part of it is habit, if I'm honest, the good kind of habit, the kind that's not really a habit, but a choice you keep making so many times it becomes a habit. Part of it is that the scar is the thing that's most true about her to me. Not because she was hurt, she'd hate me saying it that way, but because of what she was doing when it happened. She was on her own ground, standing up for what was hers, with her father's Colt in her hand and her jaw set and no give in her. And she went down on one knee and she did not drop the gun. That's what that scar means. And part of it, the part that's hardest to say to anyone, hardest even to say to her, though I think she knows, is that I'm 61 years old, and for the 20 years before I knew her I was certain that the best of me was the ground. The deed. The acreage and the cattle and the name at the bottom of every document. I was certain that I was building something real and that the building was enough to fill a life. She showed me it wasn't, not by telling me, by being what she was and choosing what she chose and staying where she stayed. She showed me that the measure of a man is not what he accumulates. It's who stays beside him and why they stay. It's whether the person who knows him best, who has seen him in the lamplight and in the hard times and in the ordinary days that are just work and weather and problem solving, whether that person would choose him again. Clara Arden chose me. She chose me knowing the costs and knowing me, which are the same thing in the end. She chose me and she stayed, and every morning she lets me hold her hand. That's the whole of it. The deed is on the corner of my desk, 43,000 acres. Her name is on it. That's everything.